Colonies Take Root, Section 2, the New England Colonies. All right, we are getting ready to talk about the geography and the people who began the New England colonies. These are our key terms. These are our people that are some of the main people working in New England at this time. So if we're looking at the 13 colonies, we can really divide them into three different parts based on geography and economics. So we have our New England colonies, which are green. We would consider those to be Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. On this map right here, it does not include Vermont, and it's because Vermont really wasn't it wasn't a colony at the time. It was just part of New York, the same way that Maine was part of Massachusetts. For both of these colonies, their charters encompassed that amount of land. So, the way we think of the boundaries of the states today is different from the way the people who lived in these colonies would have thought. We have our middle colonies, which are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. These were called the breadbasket because there was so much wheat grown there. And then finally, we have our southern colonies. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, I know surprises no one, but Maryland might surprise you. Maryland is considered a southern colony. It was one of the slaveholding colonies. The only reason why most people don't consider it part of the South is because it did not secede from the Union during the Civil War. And the only reason it didn't secede is because Abraham Lincoln put Union troops there to basically make it so they could not secede, because he knew he needed to maintain hold on Maryland in order to win the war. All right, so we talked about the current part of the United States. It's considered New England. It's the most upper portion of the eastern seaboard. You can have the you can further subdivide them into the northern New England colonies and the southern New England colonies. So you would have Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire in the north, and then in the south you have Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Geographic features in this region are the Connecticut River. You have thin and rocky soil, and you have a lot of forests and boat building. The climate is long, cold winters and short, warm summers. This has kind of an impact on farming because the shorter the growing time, the less successful your farming will be. But it was also better for the people who settled up there because it had less time for mosquitoes to, lay eggs and hatch. So fewer diseases that were transmitted through mosquitoes had time to set up in New England. I'm not saying that they never did, but it's definitely a smaller amount than somewhere like Virginia. The Puritans. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. Okay, Puritans and Pilgrims. They are basically the same. So I'm going to say all pilgrims are Puritans, but not all Puritans are pilgrims. It would be as if we take the whole ninth grade and all of them are Puritans, but only my A period are pilgrims. The Pilgrims were just the first group of Puritans to come over, and they were kind of unique when we're talking about Puritans. So that's kind of how they're different. Remember, a pilgrim with a capital P are the Thanksgiving pilgrims that we talk about, but a pilgrim with a lowercase p is just any person that is making a religious journey. So every year Muslims make a Hajj to Mecca, and they are pilgrims with a lowercase p. In England, Puritans were initially influential due to the English Civil War. So long story short, King Charles I, is beheaded because he was very much an absolute monarch and they didn't like that. He was also a secret Catholic, and Puritans were not at all in favor of Catholicism. They wanted to reform the Catholic Church. And during the English Civil War, the Puritans had a moment in time where they took over government. After the king was executed, his family left England. Eventually, though, they kind of saw the writing on the wall and they started losing their influence. Initially, King Charles I, before he got beheaded, he started taking away land and jobs and stuff like that from influential Puritans. And so, they were like, okay, well, we need to do something about this. Because at that time, it's not like everybody knew, oh, well, let's just wait a few years. We're about to kill the king. No, they didn't know that. They were like, okay, so, well, he's going to kill us. We need to get out of Dodge. The Puritans left England in the early 1600s. They fled to Holland, and that's also known as the Netherlands. They left, and while they set up new communities, they never really became integrated into Dutch society. So it was as if there was a small community of English people living in Holland. This was not how they wanted to live, and so they decided that we are going to go to the New World. The Puritans sent initially a smaller number of settlers. There's the word. I couldn't think of it. And eventually they were joined by many, many more. They began the Massachusetts Bay Company, and this particular group are the ones who settled Boston. Sorry, I'm having to look something up because I can't remember. I sat there and I was like, I'm not going to need my textbook. I'm going to remember everything. And now here we are. I'm trying to find this in the textbook because that's, of course, how life works. Okay, here we go. Found it. 900, I thought it was 900. Okay, so in 1630, 900 Puritans left in 11 ships and made their way to America. This is where we have the Massachusetts Bay Company that gets formed, and their leader was a man named John Winthrop. He and the rest of the Puritans, they believed that they 100% knew the way a Christian person should behave. And it was definitely the way they thought it was, not the way anyone else did. So if you were a practicing Puritan and you did life the way Puritans were supposed to, you were right. But if you did not, you were very much wrong and you were going to hell. John Winthrop, before they even got off the boat in Massachusetts, gave this sermon. And in this sermon, he called their new community, he referenced the Bible and said it was going to be a city on a hill, meaning they were going to be the example to the world of how a Christian community should form, how they should live, and how government and religion could form what's called a theocracy. And that was the plan. The main town, like I said before, was Boston. And by 1643, you have about 20,000 people living in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's a good-sized city, especially when, in order to make that city, people had to get on a boat and travel for like 2 months to get there. By the mid-1630s, the government in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was an elected assembly. So, it was called the General Court. Each town sent a representative to this assembly, and the voting was limited to adult members of the Puritan Church. So the way I described it in class was kind of like the way Catholics get confirmed, then they're, they've fulfilled, um, just, choosing to, yes, do live their life in the way a Catholic person should. And to be able to be a member in the Puritan church, you also had to do something similar. You had to fulfill certain obligations, and you had to go through a certain process. So just because you were a Puritan, it did not mean you were a member, quote unquote, of the Puritan church. And I do apologize if you can hear my children screaming in the background. I'm currently hiding from them and trying to get this done. So, yay. Yes, okay. So our elected assembly is called the General Court. I think I said that, but now I'm not sure. And that was our elected assembly. It's ironic that the Puritans founded their, New World communities so that they could worship as they pleased, because they did not believe at all in religious toleration. They did not think that other people had the right to different opinions because they were right. Why are you going to let someone else think the wrong way? That was kind of the way they thought. We have other colonies beginning to form in New England. And it's because when you have a group of people and you get more and more people, someone's going to disagree. And, the Puritan attitude was, well, if you don't agree with us, then you can get out. And so that's what these people did. Roger Williams was the minister of a church in the town of Salem, Massachusetts. He thought that the Puritans should split entirely from the Church of England. Puritans just wanted to purify it. So they wanted to stay Church of England, but they wanted to get rid of all the stuff that was too Catholic. But Roger Williams was like, look, no, we need to just throw it out and start over. It's too Catholic. We can't do that. We can't fix it. He did not really like it where settlers had taken Native American lands. He thought that he thought that the settlers should have to pay the Native Americans for their land. So, I can't fault him for that. He was forced out of Massachusetts Bay in 1635. He moved south and he started what is now Rhode Island. He actually bought that land from the Native Americans. In 1636, he founded the town of Providence, Rhode Island. And in 1644, the colonists in Rhode Island received a separate charter from the king, allowing them to govern themselves. So, remember, a charter is kind of like the license that you need to be able to have a colony and to organize it in, a fashion that makes sense. So they finally get their charter in 1644. In this charter, they decided that there was going to be no official religion. So it didn't matter what you believed. You could live in Rhode Island and it was fine. In Rhode Island, you had all manners of religious observance. So you had Catholics and you had traditional Church of England, you had Lutherans, you had Puritans. You also had a place where Jewish people who had been traditionally expelled from all the major countries in Europe, they were able to go to Rhode Island, worship the way they saw fit, and be able to make a life for themselves. All right, so Anne Hutchinson, she is definitely interesting. She was a woman who lived in Boston, and she did not like some of the teachings, kind of the same teachings that, oh God, what's his name? I can see the picture of him, but I immediately forgot his name. Roger Williams, that's right. So she kind of agreed with Roger Williams and was like, I don't like these Puritan teachings, people in Massachusetts. They put her on trial in 1638 and banished her from Massachusetts. She was the mother of so many children. I want to say it was like 12 or something like that. Like, she had a ton of kids. And so she went to an island initially that's like off the coast of Rhode Island. And then She went into what is today considered part of New York State and started a settlement. And eventually, she and her family were slaughtered by Native Americans. And yeah, so Anne Hutchinson, she's pretty interesting if you're, if you're like looking for a historical female to kind of research. She's pretty interesting, but yeah, she does get slaughtered by Native Americans. So. All right, so if we're looking at Connecticut now, Thomas Hooker was a minister. He, once again, is someone who disagreed with the Puritan leaders. He took 100 followers with him in 1636 and settled what is now Connecticut. He founded the town of Hartford, and other Puritans that were in Massachusetts looked at the situation that he was starting, and they were like, well, this is definitely better than what we have here in Massachusetts, so I'm going to go to Connecticut. In 1639, the colonists drew up something called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and this established a new government with an elected legislature and a governor. In 1662, that is when Connecticut received their official charter from the king, granting it self-government. So the reason why the establishment of these groups and their official charters is not always the same year is because, like they would have to establish it, and then the king would kind of go, well, let's see what you're doing, to see if, this is supposed to be, if this is going to take off or not. And, they were struggling to establish leadership around the same time that the king was kind of waiting to see if they even needed a new charter. Because if it failed, then, what's the point? So yeah, this is why our dates are off a little bit. John Wheelwright is one more person that was forced to leave Massachusetts. He agreed with some of Anne Hutchinson's views. Oh no, agreeing with a woman, that's horrible. In 1638, he and some followers moved to New Hampshire, and they founded the town of Exeter, New Hampshire. So even though it was originally New Hampshire, that part that we would consider part of New Hampshire today, it was originally considered part of Massachusetts. And so Massachusetts tried to kind of control New Hampshire, but eventually, it took a long time. In 1680, that's when the charter made New Hampshire a separate colony. So this, kind of conflict over who was in charge went back and forth for quite a while. All right, so our two big philosophies for Puritans were that they believed that towns and churches should be able to manage their own affairs. And they also thought that people should work hard and live in strong and stable families. So kind of, it's very similar to just the American way of doing things. Like, look, we can handle this, leave us alone, and we're going to work hard so that we don't all die, and our families are going to take care of each other. We don't need someone to come in and mess with that. Puritan towns were governed by setting up something called a town meeting. You might know this term from the most recent elections because they have these town halls, and they're kind of similar. It was a congregation, for lack of a better term, of townspeople that looked at local issues and settled them. Membership in the town meetings, you had to be the male head of the household. So women, of course, we know that, we weren't allowed, and definitely not children. And if you were not head of the house, you weren't considered, necessary for these town meetings. In the town meetings, they set local taxes, they elected people to run the towns. It was also kind of like a big group complaint session. So, there's someone that shows up and they're like, hey, look, his pig keeps running into my yard and trampling all of my, tomato plants. And they're like, hey, dude, put your pig in a pen so it doesn't trample his tomato plants. So, it sounds kind of petty stuff that, would come out at the town meetings, but really that's what local government does. It takes care of some of the stuff that we would think of as more of a petty, less important thing to do, but to the people who have these issues, it's very important to them. Um, these early town meetings and these very local, very grassroots um, assemblies of, like governance, they encouraged the growth of democratic ideals. Because when you have all these people that are pretty much working together to make sure that no one dies, you don't have as much social classes set up as firmly as you do in England. So, just because this person over here is, I don't know, like say a blacksmith, he's not going to be any higher or lower than your area farmer because they're all trying to do the same thing. They're all trying to, eke a living out of this frontier area. Oh, one more thing. The New England families who were trying to eke their, living out of this, they had some people that were farmers, but remember, I said earlier, farming was not quite as successful because the soil was thin and rocky, and your growth time was not as long. So, they do have farming, but not on the scale of the plantations in the South that eventually developed. So, it was still farming, but just not as huge as those places. They also have people also make leather goods and other products. Fishermen, they get on the boats and fish off the coast. These fish were probably shipped to customers in Europe. After some of it was sold, in the New World. Cod was the big industry, and right now, if you're at all interested, you can probably search cod fishing industry, and it's not doing as well because of overfishing. We have shipbuilding in this area. By the 1660s, more than 300 ships from New England were fishing off the coast or being used to take products across the Atlantic back to England. So, at this point, England had cut their forests, so they don't have the trees necessary to build these big ships, but New England definitely did. Ooh. Yeah, that's a nice, fun picture. Okay. By the 1670s, Native American populations were decreasing through disease. You also had, I was telling this to the class the other day, just because we think, yes, definitely disease, wiped through a lot of these communities, but they were also still living their ordinary lives also. So, just because my family got killed by some weird disease, it doesn't mean that that person that I've had a feud with for generations, that my family has hated, it doesn't mean we're going to stop fighting each other. So, you have just the everyday way of life along with disease that is just destroying our native communities. By about 1670, there were only 12,000 around there Native Americans in New England, which was 1/10 of their population, even just 100 years before. So, it's difficult for us to even understand the severity of how many people died from these diseases, but it was pretty terrible. All right, so in 1675, we have a huge fight, which was, the picture that you just saw. The chief of the Wampanoag, whose name was Metacom, he's also known as King Philip, he starts leading some, I don't want to say like battles because that makes me think of, like all these huge troops, but he starts kind of invading some British settlements and fighting the people. He wanted to stop Puritan expansion into the frontier. Other Native American groups from Maine to Rhode Island, they also joined this war. But some of them sided with the settlers and some of them sided with Metacom. Because remember, like I said before, if, my family has had a feud with this other family for generations, we're not suddenly going to say, oh, look, those are white people, so let's team up against them. No, we're going to be like, well, I still don't like you. Maybe I should team up with these white people and fight against you. The fighting lasted about a year, and a lot of people died. Metacom and his allies destroyed 12 English towns. So they did some pretty good damage. Things ended in 1676 because Metacom was captured and he was killed. That's kind of an anticlimactic, result. But to not have to do too much of a deep dive into King Philip's War, that's pretty much what happened. All right, so New Englanders by the 1670s are starting to kind of shift. We have our current, I guess you would say the current young population in the 1670s. They were born in America. They were raised in America. They were raised in the Puritan faith in America. So they don't have the same kind of cultural background as their parents or grandparents did. To them, they've always been Puritans. They don't understand, why would anyone ever say that they can't practice their faith? So they start getting a little bit more relaxed, I guess you would say. They're not quite as religious because, when you're being told you cannot practice your religion, people hang on to it really tightly. But then when, you can practice it freely because, you've made up your own community, people might get a little lax with the way they think about things. They were more concerned with running their farms and their businesses. And in Boston, you have successful merchants who become new community leaders. So your merchants that, they're importing things and then selling it to the colonies or exporting stuff to the old world and selling it there, they're making a lot of money. And they're starting to be the community leaders as opposed to these preachers and religious men. We have people who are now living in the colonies. They're doing well. They are living, for lack of a better term, they are living their best life. And because of that, the strict religious rules of the original founders are kind of losing influence on our people who are living there. Okay, so this is the end of this section. The best study tip I can give you is to make a timeline, to organize your dates. This is something that helps a lot of people, and they don't do it at first. So try it, see if it works for you.